you're on Zoom right now. All right, it looks like we're recording. Okay, welcome WEB22 to JavaScript 1. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to go over the training kit. So by the end of today, we're going to use function declarations, expressions, and arrow functions and describe their differences. We're going to use let, const, and var and demonstrate their differences. We're going to create and use object literals, as well as describe object properties and methods. And we're going to create and use arrays, as well as array properties and array methods. And it's really awesome because your project today is basically a review of everything we're doing in this lecture and everything that's in this training kit. So no tricks in the project today. It's just a really, really great review of everything we've done so far. Okay. All right, so I'm going to open up a code pen here, and if you clicked on that link, you'll notice it's just a blank code pen. That's because we're just going to be writing our JavaScript here, so I'm just going to bring that up, so just the JavaScript showing. And JavaScript isn't going to show up here, it's actually going to show up in something called the console. So I'm going to open my console in CodePen by clicking console down here, and I'm just going to make this full screen because this is where we're going to be working today. We're going to be working in the console. I also want to show you how you would test or find your JavaScript in the browser. So if you right click and you click on inspect, if you click here on the console, you'll see your JavaScript. If there's any errors or any console logs, you'll see them appear here in the console, and you can actually write JavaScript right in the console. So I can just, or you can add things, 1 + 1 = 2, but you can actually write directly in the console. So this is where we're going to be living for the next few days. This is where we're going to be working out of the console. So we can console.log something to have it show up in the console, and this is a method. It's used for debugging purposes, and we're going to get really familiar with it. Also, sometimes CodePen doesn't throw an error, so sometimes if your code just isn't running in CodePen, try looking in the console in your actual inspector. So sometimes you'll have to look in that real console for the error. So undefined happens because the browser is always trying to return something, and if we're not using that return keyword, then it will throw an undefined. So that's just a side note there. Okay, so first I'm going to go into the behaviors in CodePen. So let me open that up. So settings, behavior, and I'm just going to take this autosave off and this enabled off. Otherwise, it's just going to keep running over and over and over again, and CodePen might freeze. So I'll just save that. So now every time I need to run the code, I'm going to save and run so that the code runs. Okay, so let's start with variables and the differences between var, let, and const. So hopefully you've watched the videos, but it's good to go over these things multiple times so that they stick. So before we start today, what is a variable? I'm going to put a thread into WEB22 to wake everyone up, and I'll just have you reply to that thread. What is a variable? What's the purpose of a variable? What does it do? Where you store data? A placeholder? Not quite. It's definitely where you store data, stores data. Yeah. I see 51 replies, but I should be seeing like 125 replies this morning. So make sure everybody gets an answer in there. Stores a value, stores information. Yeah. So I like to think of a variable as a jar where I can put a little piece of something, like a piece of data inside of it, and then I can put it up on a shelf and access it or recall it later when I need it. So that is what a variable is. And then let's see who's done their homework. So in your own words, what is the difference between const, let, and var? Just in your own words. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to kind of get a measure of where everyone's at this morning. Scoping immutability, function scope, const is not mutable. Different ways to assign variables. Yep, all of these are looking good. Okay, we're going to dig really deep into these for the next little while. So we're going to go through each of them. So I'm going to create a variable called var test, and I'm going to assign it a value of testing. So let's do that. We're going to say var test, and make sure you're writing in your JavaScript. I was half asleep this morning when I was testing some of this stuff, and I was writing it here in my HTML, and it wasn't working, and that's why. So this is JavaScript, so we're going to write in this little JS console. So we're going to say var test equals testing. All right, and I added a semicolon to the end. Just a note, so semicolons are not needed in about 95% of JavaScript, but we like to write them at the end of an instruction for good practice so that they aren't forgotten in the 5% where they are needed. So what is this value of testing? What type of value is that? I'm gonna post another thread in WEB22. What type of value is that? Awesome, yes, it's a string. Perfect. You can see that some people have done their homework. That's great. Okay, so let's see if this thing works. So I'm gonna console.log var test. And if I save and run, let's see, save and run. Oh, it's called test, that's why. Var test, there we go. Now we can save and run. There we go, we can see it. It's appearing in the console, testing, perfect. There it is. So your names do have to match. So when we're calling var test, we've got to call it exactly, and capitals do matter here as well. All right, so let's slow down and see what's going on here. So var is a special keyword inside of JavaScript, and var is storing information for later. So by the way, if I didn't have this var keyword, would this still work? Check out WEB22 and tell me, what do you think? If I didn't have that var keyword, would it still work? Some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. Let's try it. So I'm gonna clear the console here. I'm gonna save this, and I'm gonna run. Oh, it's still working. Why is it still working? Tell me, why does this still work? Right, I'm seeing a lot of people say global. Yes, global variable. So this is dangerous because it's not giving us an answer. And this is called a global variable, and we want to avoid these. So don't do this. This happens often by accident, but we should always have a variable definition here. Okay, so don't do this. We don't want global variables. So you've probably read this in maths your whole life, this little sign here as equals to. So we're saying var test is equal to testing. But I want you to stop thinking like that. I want you to start thinking in terms of assigning the value of. So var test is assigning the value of testing. Because we actually use something else for equals in JavaScript. We use like 3 equal signs or 2 equal signs. So the 3 equal signs, that is what tests for truthiness. Whereas a single equal sign is assigning the value of. So we want to start reading this equal sign as assigning the value of. So now that we're starting with JavaScript, let's get that out of the way right away. So this is now being read as assign the value of. Another thing I want to go over here, as we discussed earlier, this variable is assigned to a string, but we can assign anything we want to a variable in JavaScript. JavaScript is loosely typed, meaning we don't have to declare what type of thing this is. So some other languages, you have to do something like this. So var testing, and then you'd have to declare the variable type here in order for it to work. In JavaScript, we don't have to declare the variable type. So I can change this to a number, for example, 9, save, clear, run, and it still works. It still shows up in the console. And I can also reassign var. So I can say var test equals 9. I can save and run, and I have 9 show up here. So that's interesting. Notice what I did here. I was able to reassign the value of the variable below it. So notice that var test can be reassigned, and I can actually do that without using that var keyword as well. So if I save, clear, run, it still shows up as 9. And there's no error. So that's because var test was created one time already, so it's committed to memory, and now we have access to it again. So this is valid code, by the way. There are no errors here. So this is something we need to be careful of in JavaScript, because as humans, we need to remember what we wrote so that we don't overwrite things later on. There are tools and libraries out there, by the way. One that I know about is called TypeScript, and that allows us to protect ourselves from ourselves. So I'm just gonna pop that in here, but you can definitely Google that after the lecture. But this is something we need to be careful of. Okay, so what happens, do you think, if I try to console.log var test before I declare my variable? So I've got a string going on in WEB22. What do you think will happen if I try to console.log var test before I call my variable? What happens? Okay, so let's try that. A lot of you are saying undefined. Let's try that. Let's take this console.log and let's move it up here before the variable. Clear, save, run. I'm getting an undefined. So you're right, I'm getting an undefined. So undefined is a good thing. It's not an error. Undefined means that we've made a mistake somewhere. JavaScript didn't make a mistake. So this is a good thing. When you see undefined, that means that there's an error somewhere in your code, and you need to go through and make sure everything's in the right order. So undefined is a good error to have. Okay, so next, I want to talk to you about a block of scope. So let's move this back down here. And we can comment it out for now. Okay, I want to talk to you about a block of scope. So I'm going to open and close these parentheses, and this is a block of scope. So before we go any further, any guesses as to what this means? What does this mean, block of scope? There's going to be lots of threads today in WEB22. What does block of scope mean? Okay, some people don't have a clue. That's okay. We're going to go through it. It's going to contain let and const, code inside of the curly brackets. Okay, lots of different answers here. Okay, so I want you to think of everything outside of these curly brackets as being global. everything we write in this program is considered to be global scope. Think of this as the world. Okay, so out here is global, the world. Okay, inside of this block of scope, think about this as a country. So the world has countries. So think about this as a country. So I'm a country. Okay, and inside of countries, we could have states or provinces. We could also have cities. And each of these states, provinces, cities, they have their own rules. And each different country has its own rules as well. So it has its own set of rules and laws inside of each block of scope. So we're going to come back to this content again and again, even tomorrow. But I want you to think of a block as a way in which we can manipulate code inside of these curly brackets. So if I come inside of this country and I console log var test, will it work? So will this work in the local scope? So if I come in here inside of these curly brackets and I console log, will it work? What do you think? Some people are saying yes. Some people are saying no. All right, let's take a look. Let's see if it works. So console.log var test. Okay, I'm gonna save and run. And look, it worked. We got the 9. So that's interesting. Why did it work? Why did it work? I'm gonna pop a thread in here. Tell me why you think it worked. All right, yep. I see some of the right answers in here. Perfect. Okay, the reason it worked is because var can be accessed on the global scope, meaning that anything inside of our curly braces can see outside. So what happens if I move var testing inside of those curly braces? So if I move this variable inside of our curly braces, and I move the console log down here outside of those curly braces, then what do we think will happen? So I'm going to move that there. I'm going to pop a thread inside of WEB22. So now what do we think will happen? Do we think this will still work? Doesn't work? No, no. Okay, let's see. So if I save this, and let's just comment this stuff out so that we don't get confused. Okay, so I'm going to save this and I'm going to run. And look, it's still working. So that's interesting. So var is uninhibited so far by the curly braces. So this brings us to one of the biggest differences between let and var. So let me introduce you to let. So var makes more sense to me because it's short for variable, but let is just another type of variable. So let's see how this is different. So we're going to keep this inside of the scope here, and we're going to say let test equal, and let's just say testing the value of our let. Okay, and then let's console.log let test. Make sure that my capitals are correct. Okay, so we're gonna save this. We can clear and run. Okay, so it works here. But what if I put it outside of the scope? So if I put it down here. So testing is being called, but let test is not working. So I'm gonna open up the inspector here because we're not getting an error. So let's go to the console. Uncaught reference error. Let test is not defined. So that's interesting. Let test is not defined. That's because of this thing called a block of scope. So remember how we talked about countries? This block of scope is like a country. So it's preventing let from leaving the country. So it's limited by this block of scope. So let's stop here and write some notes. So I want you to follow along, and I want you to write some notes with me, because these are things that are important to remember about these variables. So because we're writing notes on multiple lines, we're going to use what look like CSS comments. That's just how you write multi-line notes in JavaScript. So we're going to say var is, and well, we can say var, and then we'll write notes about var. So what do we know about var? We know that the function scoped, it's function scoped. So we'll talk about what this means in a minute. Okay, what else do we know about var? We know it can be reassigned. We know it can be redeclared. And that's crazy. We'll talk about that in a moment too. And then what do we know about let so far? We know that let is block scoped, meaning that it's stuck inside of our country. We know that the value is mutable. That means it can be reassigned, but it cannot be redeclared. And what's the difference between reassigned and redeclared? So let me put a thread in here. What's the difference between reassigned and redeclared? So start thinking about this answer here. When I say it's mutable, it can be reassigned, but I say it cannot be redeclared. What do I mean by this? Using let in front. Yeah, no use of let again. So we noticed with var test, if I put var in front of it, it could still be reassigned. But if I tried to reassign let, and let me move this over so it's a little easier to see. So if I tried to say let test equal I'm another value, and we'll move this console log here. Oops. We'll console, sorry, just 1 second here. Yeah, sorry guys, it's not my TV in the background if you're hearing background noise. I'm working in an office today, so there is a little bit of background noise. Like my stepdad has an office downstairs, so there's a little bit of background noise there from that. So I'm sorry if you can hear that background noise, but it is not my TV. Okay, so if I console.log here, let test, let's see what we get. So I'm going to clear this, save, and run. And nothing's showing up. So again, let's inspect here. Let test has already been declared. So there we go. So we can't redeclare it, but we can reassign the value. So if I wanted to take this away, save that, and run it. Let's see what happened here. We've got too many things going on. I'm just going to delete this console log for a second. So save, run, let test. Oh, console.log let test. There we go. It's not a string, it's a variable that I'm calling. So we can see I'm another value. So we can reassign the value, but we can't redeclare it. Okay, is that making sense to everyone? Can I get a thumbs up under that last thread if this is making sense to you? Thumbs down if it's not. Okay, thumbs up. All right, it's making sense to most people. Okay, if it's not making sense to you yet, don't worry, we're still gonna go through some more examples, so this will start to make sense. Okay, so with var, we can redeclare our value, and it's as if the first value didn't exist. So that's how crazy var is. With let, we can rewrite it, but we can't redeclare it. So if we've already given a variable the name of let test, we'll get an error saying that you've already used this variable name. With var, we don't get that, so that's a little crazy. So we can reassign the value, so it is mutable, but we didn't redeclare it. So if we tried to redeclare it, we'd get that error. Okay, so there's one more variable type that we're missing here, and that's the variable called const. So const looks like this. Let me just comment this out. So we'll add some more notes here just so it's easier. So var, this is let. Okay, and then let's add some const down here. So const stands for constant. It's short for constant. So we can say const, let's call this const test equals, I'm a const. Okay. So we can copy and paste basically let and const because they're very similar. So let's write some notes down here for const. We can paste that there. But there's one difference between const and let. So who knows that difference between const and let? I'm just going to put a thread in there. If yours is still undefined, maybe just watch the tutorial for now. You don't need to be typing along with me. You'll get lots of practice during your project today. So just watch for now so that it makes sense to you, and then you can always go back through this video and do it step by step with me. So what's the difference between const and let? Mutability. Const isn't mutable. Mutability. It looks like lots of people did their homework this weekend, so I'm very, very impressed. Yes, you're right. Const is immutable, which means that it cannot be reassigned. It's immutable. Okay, so moving forward, best practice is to always use const until you can't. And then when you can't, then you can use let, but never use var. So with ES6, which is the newest version of JavaScript, which is what we're teaching you, just like HTML5, it's just the newest version of JavaScript, we don't really use var anymore. You might work with people in the future that still use var because they learned JavaScript at a time when var was more common. And you know, change is hard for a lot of people, so a lot of people don't like change, so they'll just write it the way they're used to it. But best practice moving forward, use const until you can't, and then once you can't, then use let, okay? So your new variable overlord is const. So you're gonna follow that until you can't anymore. All right, so last thing before I take questions and we go on a break, how do we see the function scoping of variables? So if we tried to console.log this const outside of these curly brackets, we're going to get the same error as let. We're going to get const is not defined. It's living inside of the scope of this country. So again, that's block scope. So every time you see a curly brace, I want you to think block scope. So nothing is going to get out of there if it's a let or a const. And that's actually a really comforting thought versus a var, which is globally scoped, and that can get out of control really quickly, especially like right now, these are simple examples, but when your program is something like 3,000 lines, the chances of you reusing a variable name are quite high. So that's really scary if we can't contain them, because that's just more of a chance of an error. So we need to control var. So how do we control var? Well, I like to think of a function as a guard that doesn't let var out of the country. So let's write a function because that's the next thing we're going to do. So we'll do this quickly and then I'll take questions and we'll go on break. But let's write a function. So we're going to say function and we're going to call the function stop var. And then we're going to put some smooth brackets and then curly braces. So the code of a function goes inside of those curly brackets. All right, so these smooth brackets, I want you to think of these as a guard. So this guard is here to not let var out of this country. So if we come inside of our curly braces and we create a variable, var, and let's call it let me escape. And we're gonna set it equal to I want out. So if we were to console.log this, still inside the function, what do you think would happen? Console.log, let me escape. So what do you think will happen here? Will it show up? I'm going to drop a thread here in WEB22. What do you think will happen? All right, most of you are saying yes. So let's see. We're going to clear this, we're going to save, and we're going to run. Doesn't look like anything's happening. Why not? Why didn't this work? So let me drop another thread in there for this question. So why didn't this work? We don't even have any errors in the console. It's just not showing up. So why didn't this work? The function's missing a return. We didn't call the function. The function wasn't called. Exactly. The function wasn't called. So there's a fancy word for calling a function. Does anybody know what that fancy word is? What's that fancy word for calling a function? Go ahead and pop that in the thread. Invoke, yes. Invocation, invoking the function. Yes, so we needed to call or invoke the function. Go ahead and reply in that same thread and tell me how I would invoke a function and would I put it inside or outside of the curly brackets? Yeah, it's definitely some Harry Potter names right there. Think of a wizard as invoking the function. Okay, some people are saying outside and call the function name. All right, let's try that. Let's put it here. So we'd say stop var and the parentheses. Now we can save and run. And now we see it here. I want out. So this line of code, line 24 here, where it just says stop var, this is me invoking the function. So the function needs to be invoked before it works. And by using these parentheses, they trigger inside of our compiler the invocation of stop var, which is the function declaration. So lots of jargony terms there for you. So they trigger the invocation of stop var, which is the function declaration. Okay, so what if I put the console log after the invocation? So I'm invoking it first, there's no tricks. So I'm gonna comment this out. I'm invoking it first, there's no tricks. I'm going to put console.log, let me escape. Okay, will it show up? I'm gonna post a thread here. Will it show up if I console.log it down here? Some of you think it's a trap. What do we think? Some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. Let's save and run. So I don't see anything in my console here. Let me inspect. let me escape is not defined. That's interesting. Why is it not defined? It's not defined because it's function scoped, meaning the function keyword is guarding var from escaping the country. So that is why it's not defined. It's function scoped. So let me stop here. Let me answer some questions. All right. So I understand that console.log prints out a statement, whereas return executes code. Is this accurate? Can you distinguish when we'd want to use one over the other? So it looks like we already have some awesome replies in here. Yeah, great. So I'll let you read through those, but I'll also just touch on that quickly. So console.log is for debugging our code. It's when we want to see it here in the console. Return is when we would use the return keyword only when we're talking about functions. So we want to return something inside of the function. But in order to see it actually show up in the console, we would need to console.log it. Okay, so we've answered that one. If we flex, can we just redo the previous week, or do we have to back up and do the entire unit? I believe the way flex is working now is that you would redo the entire unit. But honestly, this is a short 3 weeks in the rest of your life. So if you just spent 3 more weeks and you had a solid understanding of JavaScript or whatever you were struggling with, you would be in such a better position to go forward and take on advanced JavaScript, React, like all of those more complicated subjects if you had just a really, really, really good understanding. So don't be afraid to use flex. So I believe you do have to repeat the 3 weeks, but it's definitely worth repeating if you're struggling with anything at all, okay? How many times can you flex throughout the course? I would suggest directing all of these questions to student success. So I just wanted to touch on it to let you know that it's an option, but let's keep flexing questions to student success because they're the decision makers there. So they have all of those answers for you. If let and var are block scoped, if let and const are block scoped, var is global scoped. Good question. Would we normally name our blocks unlike the first block in the code pen? Yeah, so usually when we use blocks of code, it's in a function or an array or an object. Like you usually just wouldn't randomly put curly braces. You would usually use them. Yeah, you would usually name them. So we want to avoid putting a semicolon after the curly brackets. Not necessarily. The semicolon can be there or not. I like to put a semicolon at the end of every set of instructions for my own sanity and reading my code, and also just because using them 95% of the time will cover your butt for those 5% of the time when they're actually needed. So that's the way I like to write it, but you don't have to put a curly brace at the end of the function here. You don't have to do that. Okay, let me go back to the questions. Good question. Can we use Repellet to follow along for today's lecture? You can use whatever you want, but I am using CodePen. So anything with a console. Also, I've given you the link to that CodePen. So as I'm saving, if you keep refreshing that link, you should be getting the code. If you're not, I can give you an updated link after the lecture. Is function scoping and global scoping the same, since var is both function and global scope? So function scoping and global scoping are not exactly the same. Function scoping, so var was not allowed to escape from that function, remember? So var is function scoped because it's stuck inside of this function. The function is a guard that stops var. All right, is there any reason we are learning var if we won't be using it? Yes, because you will see it in the wild. You're going to encounter it very often. So it's good to know that it exists and how it works. So even though it's not best practice to use it anymore, a lot of people are still using var. So it's good to see it. All right, I was expecting way more questions than that. So far so good. I'm gonna put 5 minutes up on the clock. I'd like you to step away from your computer for 5 minutes. All right. 5 seconds left. Everyone's coming back from break. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is functions. And I realize that we're already halfway through the lecture. If I go over time today, if you need to, excuse yourself for lunch, we're all adults here, so you can go ahead and do that. And then these lectures are recorded, so you can always come back and watch the last half of it. I'm going to try to fit everything in before lunch. But if we happen to go over, no questions about lunch. If you need to excuse yourself, then you can excuse yourself. Okay, let's talk about functions. So in JavaScript, functions are considered to be first-class citizens. This means that functions are just as important as objects, where in other languages, functions are not. So they can be passed around. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. And functions can be passed around as parameters. So we're going to see more of that tomorrow. But first of all, what is a function? So in your own words, I'd like you to tell me what you think a function is. So go ahead and drop your answers in that thread. And I want to see 125 answers. So I want everybody to answer. If you don't know, just write, I don't know. I just want to see everybody's answers. A gateway to JS, a small kind of program, a block of code, perfect. These are all good answers. Okay, so for me, that guard statement really helped me because basically functions protect a block of code until they are invoked. So that's a really good way to think about functions. It's something that protects a block of code until it's invoked. So there are different types of functions and different use cases for each, and I want to talk about 3 different types of functions today. So the first one that we've written here, this is called a function declaration. Okay, so this is a function declaration. And I feel like I spelled declaration wrong, but that's okay. So that's what we've just written. So what I've done is I've declared a function. So let's see if I can reference this. So I'm going to invoke my function. And I'm going to put this console.log up here. And I'm actually going to call the function name. So let's see if I can reference this function before the function is called. So what do you think? Can I reference a function before I declare it? So can I reference a function before I declare it? What do you think? Okay, lots of people are saying yes, I think so. All right, let's try this. So save, run. All right, so we're referencing the function here. So it's calling the whole function. It's saying that function stop var, and it's showing what's inside of that function. So we can reference a function before we call it. But in order for the function to execute, we need something inside of the function. We need to use a keyword to call that variable below the function. So what keyword do I need to use? Return. Yeah, we need to use that keyword return. So I would put that return statement here. So I'm going to return, whoops, if only I could spell today. Return, let me escape. Okay, so the return keyword needs to be inside of the function. So in this case, stop var is being invoked inside of console log. So if I console.log stop var down here. And I have to invoke it here. Okay, let's comment this out. Clear, save, run. I want out. So now it's showing up here. So it's showing up because of that return keyword. Okay, so in this case, we can reference the function before we declare it, because in the compiler, that reference to stop var is brought to the top of the scope. So this bringing to the top of the scope is called two-pass compilation. And I have a great article for you here on how the JavaScript engine works. And I don't want to spend a ton of class time on this, but I'm going to pop that into Slack, and it's this article here, and it's why you should understand how the engine works. So I want you to take some time at some point today and read this article and get an understanding of how that works. Okay, so on the first pass, the compiler is looking for references, and on the second pass, it's looking for values. So on the first pass, it tries to find, is stop var referenced? Well, the cool thing about functions is that they're just placeholders for the stuff inside them. So it actually makes sense that stop var was brought up here first, so that the compiler, so that it's as if it's already existed in the compiler once we console logged the reference, and then it came inside of the function and did all the work down here. So when we returned and we called console.log, that's when it came inside of the function and it did all of the work. So that is the concept of hoisting, and I'm sure you've heard that term before in these videos, hoisting. So I'm going to give you an MDN doc of hoisting. Let me pop that in here and I'll open it up on my screen as well. So this is the article I've just given you, this article on hoisting. So just a note, even though hoisting does exist, and I'll let you read this article as well, this article on your own, because I don't want to take up too much class time doing it. But just, even though hoisting does exist, it's always better practice to try and console log or do something after the function. So it just makes your code more readable. So even though we could reference the function up here before it's called, better practice would be to do it after the function just to make your code more readable. So the next person reading your code knows what you're referencing or what's going on. So these MDN docs, I want you to get really familiar with these because these are a great resource. These are like the leading source on JavaScript documentation on the internet right now. And we love to read documentation by now because we're all developers, and developers love to read documentation to understand how things work. So get really familiar with these documentations. If you're Googling anything JavaScript related, you're probably going to want to put MDN somewhere in that Google search. So this is your JavaScript Bible, for lack of better words. Okay, so it takes variables and functions and brings each of them to the top of their respective scopes. So notice I just said respective scopes. This means that the var is stuck inside of the scope of code until we return it. So the guard here is stopping var from escaping this scope until we return it. So if we didn't have a return here on line 23, it would not be able to get out. So keep that in mind. Scope is a big deal. These curly brackets, they're a big deal. So this is why it's important not to use globals, because globals can be referenced by any function. So if all the other variables were global and we forgot their names, for example, we could quickly mess things up in our code. So this is a super new concept to a lot of you, and I want to give you one more source on it that I have written down here. So let me also put this. All right, so please take the time to read these resources after the guided project if you're struggling with any of these concepts. This is a totally new way of thinking about things and approaching things. JavaScript is a totally new way of thinking. So far, we haven't been writing any programming languages. HTML and CSS are not programming languages, they're markup languages. JavaScript is the first time we're touching programming languages, so it's totally new way of thinking about things. Okay, so in this case, the function declaration is hoisted to the top of its scope. So let's talk about that return keyword. The return keyword returns something back wherever it was invoked. So in this case, we invoked stop var, we called stop var, said I'm going to return, and stop var said I'm going to return this variable inside of the function to you. So we called stop var here, and it returned the variable inside of the function to us here in the console, okay? Okay, let's do another example. So let me comment this out. Let's do another example. Let's do something that is probably a little bit more valuable and a little bit more likely to be used in the real world. So I'm gonna create a function. I'm gonna call it add. And I'm going to give it some parameters. So num1, num2, and I'm going to return num1 plus num2. Okay. So we can see how return statements are even more powerful because they can return something that's actually being operated on. So we're going to invoke the add function here, and we're going to add something together. So let's invoke it. So we're going to console.log. First, we need to invoke it. So let's call it add. And num1, whoops, console.log, we can say add. Num1, let's give it 2 and 3. So we'll add those together. Okay. So I'm going to clear our console. I'm going to save and run. And we get 5. So 2 plus 3 is 5. Perfect. So it's working. Okay, so what are these two numbers called down here? In the context of invocation. What are those two numbers called? Okay, some people are saying arguments, some people are saying parameters. These are not called parameters. These are called arguments. I just want to make that super clear so that we're all on the same page. So these are parameters, and they're placeholders. The things we pass into them are called arguments. So let's make a note here. What we pass into parameters are called arguments. So these are the parameters up here. These are just placeholder values. The argument is the actual value that we pass in to the parameters. So there's an important distinction here. Arguments are actual values. Parameters only care about which order they are being brought in. So the name doesn't matter at all. So I could go change this name to blah. It doesn't matter. This is still going to work. They only care about the order. So if I run that, I'm still going to get the 5. It's still going to work. Come on. Oh, this has got to match. There we go. Save, run. There we go. I still get 5. It still works. So some of you are probably thinking, okay, I get this. this is boring, move on. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here, because these terms are really important, and they're going to be important for you to understand these things moving forward. So if you can understand these fundamentals, you're going to be in a great place for advanced JavaScript and React. So for those of you who know this, bear with me. I want to make sure the whole class is on the same page with these terms. Okay, so it works no matter what name we pass into these parameters. But best practice would be to give it a name that makes sense so that the next developer reading our code understands what the heck is going on. Because if I just named everything like X or Y or blah, the next developer would have no clue what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to do, and it would take them so much longer to decipher my code. So we want to make sure that we're giving parameter names that make sense. But JavaScript doesn't care what we pass in as arguments either. So what if I put, instead of 2 numbers, I'm going to put 2 strings. So instead of adding 2 numbers together, I'm going to put 2 strings. So let's put JavaScript is, and then our second string is going to be fun. Okay, so we can save and run. And I get JavaScript is fun. And notice that it's respecting the white space here as well. So this white space, it counts as a value inside of this string. So this white space is being respected. So strings can be passed in as arguments, numbers can be passed in as arguments, we can pass anything we want in as arguments. So I want to show you here that the plus sign can either add things together, or it can do something called concatenation, which means that it puts values together, it puts strings together. So it can be an operator, it can add, but it can also concatenate. So we can pass strings in as those arguments as well. Okay, so we've talked about function declarations. We know that these are arguments, these are parameters. We also know that the return word is returning something back to the invocation. Okay, can I write code after my return statement? What do you think? Can I write code after my return statement? Okay, some of you are saying no, some of you are saying yes, but it won't run. Let's see. So let's console.log. It's working. Okay, we'll comment that out. Clear, save, run. So nothing's showing up. So the answer is no. It terminates, so the return statement is terminal. It means that it doesn't allow anything after it to run or to be declared. So it's lethal afterwards. It kills any code that is written after it. So I guess both of you are right. No, you can't, or yes, you technically can, but it won't run. So the answer is no. It kills everything after. So we can delete this. I just wanted to show you that you cannot execute code after that return statement. Okay, it's important to remember this because you won't get an error here. It just won't work. So this is going to happen to you at some point. It's happened to me before. So make a note of this and always double check that nothing is written after your return statement if the code isn't running. Okay, that could be where your error is and you're not going to get an error. It just won't work. All right, next thing we're going to talk about, and let me move these notes up here where our variables are just so we can get some space here. All right, so we'll go down here. So the next thing we're going to talk about is function expressions. Okay, so function expressions are interesting in that we can actually bring back variables. So remember var, let, and const. So what I mean by that is we can actually house functions as variables. So what do I want to use here? Var, let, or const? Give me a quick thread, or give me a quick answer in this thread. What am I going to use to declare this variable? Var, let, or const? What do you think? All right, yeah, most of you are saying const, awesome. Yeah, so remember that we want to use const until we can't use const anymore. So we're going to say const function expression test, and in the real world I probably wouldn't give it a name this long, but we can say equals test. Okay, so this is what we expect a variable to look like. But we can actually replace these strings with actual functions. So here's where it gets a little crazy. So because we know this is going to be a function, and because we've already given it a name here, we don't have to rename it. So we can avoid confusion later. So does anyone know what this is called when we don't give a function a name? Does anyone know what that is called? I'm going to pop a thread in here. What happens when we don't give a function a name? What is that called? Anonymous function. Yes, it's called an anonymous function. It goes straight into the invocation of a block of code. So a function expression would usually have a name after the function keyword. In this case, we don't need two names. We just go straight into the function, and this is called an anonymous function. So however, we did name it over here with the const. So is it truly anonymous? I'll let you decide. So we call these function expressions. So let's go ahead and do the same kind of stuff we were doing with add. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy it, and I'm just going to put it here, and we can take away this add. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to console log this now. So I'm going to say, first I need to invoke it. So function expression test. And let's give it 2 numbers. And then I'm going to console.log. Actually, we're not going to give it numbers when we invoke it. We're going to give it numbers in the console log. So let's give it 1 and 2. Okay, save, run. I think we need this function keyword here. Save, run. It's not working. Let's see. Can anyone spot my error? Oh, no, it's working. It's just taking a moment to load. Okay, so we have 3. Perfect. So it's working here. So if I save and I run, we can see that it works. It does work in the same way. So awesome. So in this case, the function expression is doing the same thing that we did with add. So why do all of this work and confuse ourselves to write this extra step? Like, you're probably thinking, that's great. Like, how is this actually useful? Well, it's because when we have a function that's housed inside of a variable, we can actually use it in a more compact way. So we're going to talk about this tomorrow with callbacks. So if you're thinking, like, this doesn't seem useful to me, hold that thought until we get to callbacks tomorrow. So you can see that each day is going to kind of build off the last. So I'm going slow today because everything we're doing here is really important for what we're learning the rest of the week. Like, these are the foundations. So for today, I want you to get used to seeing this and calling it what it is. It's a function expression. So a function expression allows us to do something even more unique, which is called an arrow function. So that's the last function I want to talk about. Arrow functions. And arrow functions, they're becoming more and more popular in their syntax and usage. So arrow functions are pretty new. Not everyone's using them yet, but they are becoming more and more popular. So let's see an arrow function in action. So we're going to say const arrow test equals, and then we can say function, and we can do the same function. Here, I'm just going to copy and paste it. save us writing it out. Okay. So we can do the same thing, and then let's console log down here. Let's just take this. Arrow test, we'll console log arrow test. Just to make sure it's still working. Okay, save, run. Yeah, so it's still working. So before we do anything else, we just wanted to check that this was actually running correctly. Okay, so it is working. So now I want to convert this function expression into an arrow function, or sometimes you'll hear the term fat arrow function. So let me show you what that looks like. So basically you delete the function keyword, and on the right side, you throw in an arrow. And you can see why it's called a fat arrow, because it has the equal sign instead of just like the dash. So equal sign, angle bracket, and that's it. That is an arrow function. So not too difficult in the syntax. This is the simplest conversion we can do. So let's test this and see that it still works. So I'm going to clear. I'm going to comment these out because we are getting, there we go, save, run. Let's make sure that still works, and it still works. So we still get that 3 there. Okay, so that's awesome. So I'm using this new version of JavaScript to do this. Const and let are also part of this newer version of JavaScript. So it's called ES6. We talked about this a little bit earlier. It's just like we're using HTML5, which is the latest version of HTML, or CSS3, it's the latest version of CSS. So we're using ES6, which is still a form of JavaScript. We're still writing JavaScript. We're just writing the latest version of JavaScript. So a lot of you might be thinking right now, why in the world is this useful? It's only a little bit shorter. What is the point? Well, there's a lot more that we can do with this. So for example, we can actually remove the return keyword and the curly brackets, but we're not going to do that right now. I just want to show you that arrow functions can go much deeper. So I'm going to give you some documentation on some arrow functions because we're going to be going deeper into this tomorrow. But I don't want to go any deeper into arrow functions today. I just want you to see like what they actually look like. Let me. All right, there we go. Drop some documentation in there for you. We should all be like loving documentation right by now. We should all be in the habit of reading documentation. So I just wanted you to know what they look like. And for today, I just want you to get in the habit of converting these functions. However, arrow functions do have a lot more value. For example, the non-binding of the this keyword, that's a little bit too much for today. Just know that they're useful and we are going to be using them a lot moving forward. So we do need to get in the habit of seeing them and seeing how they work. So arrow function recap. You take out the function keyword and know that it is derived from a function expression. So that is all you need to know for today. You take out the function keyword and it's derived from a function expression. Those are the only things you need to know about arrow functions today, okay? So I'm going to stop here and answer some more questions. So var can see into a function but not escape the function. Correct. Var is function scoped. Why do we need to add the parentheses on the line before when you already have console log? We need to invoke the function before we can call console log the function outside of the function. That is why. What's the reason for the capital letters for variables and words? It's called camel casing, and it's just to separate the words. Yeah, so camel casing is very common for variables. So perfect, it is best practice. It does come up later in the week, but really good question. Where do I see the JavaScript of a website? Like I would see the HTML and the CSS. Yeah, good question. So we click on inspect, and it's in the console. So you can see there's some JavaScript running in there. That's where we would see the errors. If we actually wanted to see the JavaScript, we'd look in sources to find the JavaScript in there. But in the console is where you're going to be living for the next little while. You're going to look for any sort of communication with JavaScript inside of the console. So good question. Can you please explain invoking? I did not understand that explanation. Yes, invoking a function is just calling the function. So when we write a function, we actually have to call the function in order to make the function run. And invoking is just a fancy name for calling the function. Which function type, expression, declaration, arrow is the most common in actual development wild? They're all common. They all have different use cases. So that question will be answered probably more as you're doing. You'll see when arrow functions are useful, when they're not, and also the rest of the week you'll get to see when arrow functions are a bit more useful when we actually go and use them more. Okay, does spacing matter after the arrow? For example, const arrow test. I am actually not sure if spacing matters. I don't think it does, but let's test it out. So this is a really good use case for if you want to know the answer to that question, just go ahead and test it. So save, run, and it still works. So it looks like the spacing doesn't matter. So that's the answer to that. Okay, I want to give you another quick 5-minute break before we get into the rest of this. So go ahead and step away from your computers for a few minutes. All right, welcome back. Okay, let's talk about objects. We have about half an hour left, and I think that's some time. So let's talk about objects. Okay, so you may have heard from videos or articles that everything is an object in JavaScript, and that is true. So we're going to be talking about what that means in the coming days. But for now, I want you to understand what an object actually is. So in a lot of ways, objects are just fancy variables, and they are just fancy ways to basically contain more information. So let's start with object literals. And that means that we are literally writing an object instead of inheriting from it abstractly. So let's write our first object. So I'm going to use that const keyword again, and we're going to call this object dog. So everything up until now looks like a variable. So that's why we've spent so much time on variables, to really understand that syntax. But here's where things get different. So we've added strings to the right side of that variable, we've added numbers, we've added functions, and now we're just going to add a block of code. Okay, so every object has two portions. The top portion is key value pairs, and we call this properties. And a lot of you should start to recognize this now from CSS, because CSS has key value pairs that are called properties. And the other portion we call methods, and they're basically functions. Functions of the object, and they're called methods. Okay, so let's see how things work. So a key value pair is a pair of data. So on the left side, we could have something like name. And on the right side, we just give it a name. So for example, this has to be a string. We can say Ada. So instead of using a semicolon here, like in CSS, I'm going to use a comma. Whoop, what did I just do? There we go. I'm going to use a comma. And the comma basically is saying and. Like, and I want to do something else. And there's more information. So just like in our parameters, how we use a comma to separate parameters, we use a comma here to separate these key value pairs. So I'm going to add a couple of other key value pairs here. So let's add breed. We'll say Bolly dog. Let's add color. So we could say brindle. Okay, let's add age. And we can just give it a number 2. Okay, so these are all key value pairs. We have the thing or the piece of data that we're referencing on the left side, and the actual value of that data on the right side. Now we're going to go down to the second portion of what makes an object literal, and that's a function. So I'm going to create a function down here, and I'm going to call this function eat. And I can say function. And here I can use the function keyword as an anonymous function because we've set up the reference on this side here. So we've set up the name of the function eat over on the left-hand side. So now I can just call the function anonymously. So this syntax right here, it's called a method. And so for a long time, I found the difference between a method and a function confusing. So I want to make it very clear to you. A method is a function that is housed inside of an object. So we're going to return a string here, and we're going to return likes to eat steak. Okay. So now I've got some key value pairs, which are called properties, and I've got a function, which is called a method. Okay, so let's see how this works. So just like console.log, console is an object, .log is a method, it logs the argument to the console. we are going to say dog because that's the name of the object. Then we're going to use that dot notation or that dot syntax as a way of accessing the values inside of here. So on the left side of our colon, these are the things or the values that we can access, and the right side is the actual information. So I can say something like dog.name. Okay, so before I run this, will this code show up in my console? Will I see anything in my console? So I'm just going to pop a thread in here. No, not yet. Why not? So why will I not see anything inside of my console? So save, run, and you're right, I don't see anything in there. Console.log. It's not being called. No console log. Okay. So it didn't run in the console, but I want to talk to you here about that word invocation. So are we invoking dog or are we referencing dog? What do you think? Are we invoking dog or are we referencing dog here? Referencing. A lot of people think we're referencing. That's right, we're referencing. We're referencing it, but we'll call something inside of the animal soon. So let's borrow that console log. Console.log. And we're going to say dog name. So let's save this. We can clear. Save, run. Looks like I'm still getting an error here. So does anyone see my error here? I need a comma. Where do I need a comma? After the 2, after age. Do we think that's the issue? Save, run. That was the issue. We needed a comma. So yes, if you forget, you can see how important these commas are. If we're forgetting these commas, then we're breaking things. Since we're calling a function after the key value pairs, there was something else after the 2, so we needed that comma. Okay, so now I get my dog.name, which is Ada. So that's pretty cool. And I can recall as many of these things in the console log as I want. So I can also say comma dog.age, and I should be able to save and run. And yeah, I'm getting the name and the age. So that's pretty cool. So you can see how useful these things are. So objects can hold an infinite amount of properties and an infinite amount of methods, whereas variables could only hold one thing. So if we go back up here to our variables, they can only hold one thing, but objects can hold an infinite amount of things. So this gets really, really useful. So let's console.log something else. What if I wanted to invoke that eat method? So I could just use that doing dot syntax, but is that enough? Can I just say eat? Can I just say dog.eat? Will that run? No. What do I need to do? It needs parentheses. Awesome. So there's a difference. So let's run that here before we move forward. So you can say dog.eat. We need those parentheses on there. So let's clear the console, save, and run. Likes to eat steak. Awesome. So there's a difference between the invocation and just calling the reference. And that difference is the parentheses. And I was I was calling a function here and I was calling the function here in the console log, but I just really wanted to drive home the point that you needed to call the function. But I could remove that. But I just wanted to drive home the point that that function needs to be called before it's going to show up. Okay, so that's the difference between an invocation and just calling the reference. Okay, so we can put as many methods as we want in here as well. So we just need to put a comma if we're adding something else. So let's create another function. So let's create a function called chase. And we will put a return inside of there, and we'll return a string. Likes to chase squirrels. Okay, and then I can console.log chase. So save and run. Okay, something happened here. What do I need to do here? What am I missing? Why isn't this working? Yeah, I need that dot notation. So I need to say dog dot chase. So now I should be able to clear, save, and run. Likes to chase squirrels. Perfect. So a lot of this may seem really, really repetitive to you, but I'm really just wanting to drive home these points. So let's open up the documentation on MDN. So I'm going to just give you the MDN website here so that you can bookmark it for later. But I think we should open up the documentation on objects in MDN. So if I was going to do that, I would Google something like objects MDN. Okay, and then I have all of my documentation here on objects. So look at all of the different methods that we can use with objects. We can use different properties. So we can click on any of these to get more information. So we really want to take some time and read this documentation. If I didn't put MDN in front of that Google search and I just Googled objects, I'm getting like grammar and probably things that I'm not really looking for. So that MDN is pretty crucial. Objects in JavaScript, but so MDN is the third one down here, but if you just put MDN into your Google search when you're searching for things with JavaScript, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple more questions here. Yeah, so we just went through this. Perfect. Any other questions on objects? We went through objects quickly, but they're very, very useful. They're pretty simple to understand because they're basically just a function that holds more values. And they can also, they're basically just a variable that holds more values, and they can also hold functions. Are objects like libraries in Ruby? I'm not sure. I don't actually write any Ruby, so I'm not sure, but I'm sure that you could Google that to figure out if they are like libraries in Ruby, but I don't want to give you the wrong answer there. Can we put an argument into methods? Yes, you could put an argument into the function in methods. You could pass an argument into these parentheses here. Sorry, here. So these functions will still take parameters and they will still take arguments. So we could add something there or we could do something else. Awesome. Last thing, because yeah, we've got 15 minutes. So let's just go through the last thing so that I don't have to take up too much of your lunchtime. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is arrays. So basically we've just been talking about fancy ways to hold information. So we've talked about var, we've talked about let and const, we've talked about ways to protect information inside of a block of code using functions. We've talked about function expressions, we've talked about arrow functions, we talked about properties and methods inside of objects. So arrays are another big fundamental piece of JavaScript. I would say they're one of the biggest fundamental pieces for holding information. So think of an array of information, like lots of information. So they're another big piece to holding information. So with arrays, we can store lots of values in a different way than we can store values with an object or object literal. So object literals are usually name value pairs. Arrays are a different way of storing values. So I'm going to create an array with a list of some of my favorite cities. So I'm going to const cities. And remember, we're using that const keyword until we can't anymore. So instead of curly braces here, I'm going to use square brackets. So whenever you see these square brackets, I want you to think array. So these square brackets, this here is an array in its simplest form. So what is an array? Well, it stores information, and order is the most important thing in an array. So order, the order in which things are brought in, that's what we're paying attention to in an array. So let's list some cities here. So my favorite city, Tel Aviv, and then Cape Town, I would say is probably my second favorite. New York. Okay, another favorite here is Kigali. Let's list another favorite, Istanbul. And finally, let's say Lisbon. Okay, so I've got a list here now of my favorite cities, and they're in order. They're in the order of which I like them best. So let's console log cities and see what this looks like. So we can console.log cities. And I want to comment some of this stuff out so that we don't keep getting these answers in here. Okay, so clear, save, run. Okay, so now I've got my list of cities. So this is what it looks like. This is what an array looks like. It's a list. So it looks exactly like this array here. So what's special about this is that the computer has actually assigned a position to each of these values. And the important thing to remember about arrays, and the thing that took me a little bit to wrap my head around, is that the position starts at 0. Okay, so Tel Aviv has a 0 count, and then we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So for a total length of 6. There's 6 things in this array, but if we try to find item number 6, it doesn't exist. That's because the array starts at 0. So why does this matter? Because we can access anything inside of our array using array syntax. So remember, we have these square brackets. Well, inside of these brackets, we can actually tell the array which item to grab. So we want to understand the order, the number that is assigned to these different values inside of an array. So let's comment this out. And let's console.log cities, and let's grab the first value in there. So I'm going to grab the value of 0. Okay, so if I clear and I hit save and run, I should get Tel Aviv because it's the first value in there. So I'm just going to copy and paste this into the console 6 times just so we can see what this looks like. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we'll change this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we can save and run, and it lists out all of the individual cities. So each of these cities are assigned a value or a number. So this is cool, but why are arrays valuable? Well, let's go back to those MDN docs. So we can search for that, MDN array. So you can Google that with me, MDN array. Okay, so let's look at our properties and our methods and look at how many methods we have available to us. So arrays can do some crazy stuff, and there's so many cool things that we can do with data. So we're gonna get to prototype on Wednesday. So we see all of these prototype. We're gonna get to prototype on Wednesday. But for now, let's look at length. So let's find that length. Prototype of. Length, here we go. So we want to look at length. So that array name dot length tells you how many things are inside of the array. So for example, here we have 4 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, even though the values assigned to them would be 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we tried to look for that 4th value, it wouldn't exist. This number here that is assigned to sweaters, that would be 3 because shoes starts at 0. Okay, so let's go back and let's console.log, so we can comment this stuff out. Let's console.log, and we're gonna look for the length here. So we can say cities.length, and notice we're using dot notation again. Okay, just like dot name. So we can clear, save, run. Okay, and it's telling us we have 6. We have 6 things in the array. So how is this helpful to us? Why would we want to know this information? I'm going to drop a little thread in here. How is this helpful to us? Ah, I see. Yeah, perfect. Looping for loops. Yeah. So when we start loops, we're going to want to know how many values are in an array. It defines bounds for loops so that we don't get into infinite loops and things like that. Okay, so what if I did something like this? What if I did cities? So we're going to console.log cities, and then we're going to put those square brackets in there, and we're going to say cities.length, and we're going to say -1. So what will this return? What do you think this will return? The last item, 5, the last item in the array. Yeah, it's going to return, it should return Lisbon. So let's run this. Perfect. Yeah, so that returns the last item in the array. So I'm going to give you this cheat sheet here. It's in the training kit, but I'm just going to drop a link for you. Let me just pull it up here. So this cheat sheet it's been like an invaluable resource to me. Whoops. Uh-oh. There we go. There we go. It's been an invaluable resource to me. So it basically tells you in English, what, like just in plain English, what you can do. And then if you click on here, it gives you an example with code. So get last item, it shows here, meal.length -1, and you'll get dinner. So it gives you very, very clear examples of what you can do, and it tells you in plain English here the thing that you're actually doing. So I have found this super, super, super useful. Okay, so I want to stop here and answer any questions. Okay, so I think we've gone through this. Yep. What's the index number for items inside of methods? They don't have an index. So yeah, that's why arrays are super useful. So inside of methods, if we go back here, we've got all of these key value pairs, but they're not necessarily indexed. We actually have to reference the key, like we have to reference the property in order to get the value. All right, is object literal a different name for an object? So object literal is an object that we actually write rather than an object that we inherit. So it's like setting up an object. We're literally typing out the key value pairs. Yeah, exactly. Why does slice return the brackets around the value that is being removed? I don't remember doing slice. If it's not an example that we've referenced here, just reach out to your TL and we'll talk about that. We just don't have time to go through other examples here, and I just don't want to confuse anyone. How do you add something in the middle of an array? I'm not going to go through that with you guys today because I think it is in your project, so you'll have time to practice that. But if you're wondering how to add things, I would probably go to this cheat sheet and find an example here and try it out. Should we use only dot notation, or should we get used to utilizing bracket notation as well? For today, I want you to use dot notation, but you will eventually be using bracket notation as well. But just to keep things simple, and because dot notation is easier to read, today we are using dot notation. So great questions. Awesome. Okay, I want to go into the training kit. I know we have 2 minutes left, so I'll do this quickly. And I just want to take a look at today's assignment. So I'm going to scroll down here. JavaScript 1. Okay, this is basically an overview of everything that was in the training kit and everything we've talked about in the lecture today. So it's just some really good practice with the fundamentals. So I'm going to go into the index.html. All right, so you'll notice all of these script tags in here. So this is how we call JavaScript into the browser. So we need to be able to see it in the console, and we do that by calling the script tags into the index.html. So the script tags, they can go in the head of the document, but a better place for them would be before the closing body tag. But in this case, it works both ways. So I also want to tell you about a VS Code extension, because I'm sure that this has probably been passed around by now. It's called Quokka, VS Code. Okay, this one here. So this allows you to see the code you're writing without jumping into your browser. So it's probably going to come in handy for you moving forward. And I do recommend that you start using it, but starting tomorrow. Today, I would recommend you stay away from Quokka just because it's fundamental day. And I actually think that using your browser and using the inspect tool is a very useful skill set. So I would like you to learn it. So use your console for today. You can use Quokka tomorrow. So use your console for today. The last thing I want to note here is in this project, make sure, as always, that you are going through the README file and you're just following instructions. So make sure that before you start, you go through and actually read the instructions in the README file. All right, we'll see if there's any Final questions. Does JS get easier after today, just like Flexbox made CSS easier? JS doesn't get easier necessarily after today, but it does get easier the more you use it. The more you start writing JS, the more you start thinking this way, these concepts will get easier and easier to wrap your mind around. So if you feel like a fraud after today, like, not a big deal. Everybody feels like a fraud the first time they write JavaScript. It's not necessarily an easy thing. It will get better. Just keep working hard. I promise it will get better. Another thing that I just wanted to mention quickly before we go, for those of you that do know JavaScript already, and a lot of this is review, I would like you to help in the help channel, but I want you to not flex your ego too much or really show off what you can do, because I think that's going to just inflare the imposter syndrome even more for those people who are still struggling. So maybe keep all of the cool things that you can do with JavaScript in your back pocket until the end of this week, so that we're not intimidating everyone who is just writing JavaScript for the first time. So definitely share, definitely pair program, definitely be helpful. Just maybe avoid really showing off what JavaScript can do until the end of this week when we're all on the same page with these fundamentals. All right, it's your lunchtime, so go and eat and enjoy your lunch, and I will see you tomorrow.